people are having their own identity crisis. But the fact that we're able to do that we have the freedom to work through these thorny issues and, in some cases, even to renounce that British identity completely and adopt a Welsh, Scottish, and Northern Irish and Northern identity, that is paradoxically something that makes Britishness quite appealing to me. Over the course of this podcast, I found that Britishness is a lot more open and a lot more up for debate than I thought it was. And I think I'm finally ready to make a decision. I woke up today and I looked out at the typically gloomy, rainy, grey British day outside, and I started looking into passport applications. You've been listening to United Singdom, presented by me, Zing Sing, and produced by Viv Jones.
Hi, I'm David Edmonds of the BBC World Service, and this is The Big Idea. I found the most fascinating ideas around and the people who thought them up, and I'm going to do my best to explain them. Today's big idea: how many people does it take to topple a dictator?
Freedom, yes. Apartheid, no. Freedom, yes. Apartheid, no.
Unlike unpopular democratic governments, dictators can't be voted out. But there are other ways to oppose them. Political scientist Erica Chenoweth studies opposition to dictatorship, comparing violent resistance to non-violent. In recent history, there have been many non-violent movements.
So this would include, say, the Solidarity movement in Poland against communist rule there in the 80s. It would include the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, but it would also include the movement against Augusto Pinochet in Chile. More recent examples would include the Algerian Revolution of 2019, often called the Smile Revolution, and even a movement against a corrupt and misogynistic governor in Puerto Rico in 2019 in July.
Soon, we'll hear which works best, violence or non-violence. But demonstrations are only one form of non-violent protest. There are petitions and posters, strikes and boycotts, sit-ins and walkouts. Indeed, according to one well-known protest classification, there are 198 forms of non-violent protest. Not that the distinction between violence and non-violence is always clear-cut. Professor Chenoweth describes three types of protest, which are not so easily pigeonholed.
The first would be an unarmed event where people are actually expressing hateful or discriminatory or dispossessive aims. The other gray area would be more about the means themselves, so property destruction is sometimes a gray area, although I think most activists would not include that in their definition of violence because it's often symbolic. And then there's also self-harm, so things like self-immolation or hunger strikes, which cause harm to the self but not to others.
Nonetheless, most forms of protest are either patently violent, like assassinations, or patently non-violent, such as a vigil or a march. Professor Chenoweth's research aimed to answer a simple question. If a movement wanted to achieve a certain goal, such as toppling a dictator, what strategy was most likely to work, violence or non-violence? With a colleague, she studied every protest movement on which there was sufficient data, starting in 1900 all the way to 2006. And
non-violent campaigns succeeded about half the time, and violent campaigns succeeded about a quarter of the time.
To put it another way, a movement was twice as likely to be successful if it was non-violent. The next question is, why? Well, the main reason appears to be that violence reduces a movement's support base. In contrast, many more people will actively join non-violent protest.
So in general, on average, nonviolent campaigns are able to garner more participation than violent campaigns because it's easier to participate in most nonviolent methods. It's more convenient to participate. Generally speaking, it's lower risk. It requires less physical ability. It requires less advanced training. And that means that many of the methods of nonviolent action are accessible. So you tend to see much higher participation rates among women, children, the elderly, people with disabilities, other people who've been marginalized in the population, precisely because the methods of nonviolent action, like a demonstration, are just easier for people to participate in with lower risk to themselves and their futures than armed campaigns.
Terrorist groups and assassination squads tend not to be populated by septuagenarian or octogenarian grandparents. Non-violent campaigns are a different matter.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, in Serbia, during the bulldozer revolution, which was trying to oust Slobodan Milosevic in the late 90s and 2000, there was a particular tactic called grandparents' protests. The youth, kind of the main cohort mobilizing this uprising, would get their grandparents to come and stand on either side of them because the youth alone were getting pretty badly beat up and abused by the police, but when their grandparents were with them, it activated all kinds of social and cultural taboos against abusing the elderly, and so they were much safer.
The larger the demo, the more likely it is that members of the security forces will have a friend or family member participating in it, and so they'll be much less willing to use force. That reluctance seems to have been a factor in the successful non-violent protest movements in Tunisia and Serbia.
If a mass movement comes to include a broad segment of society, it starts to just look like their family and friends and so forth. They may even recognize their family and friends in the movement and decide that they don't want to shoot these people.
So how big does a protest need to be to make success almost inevitable? Professor Chenoweth has examined thousands of protest movements and crunched the numbers, and has come up with a very precise figure.
Generally speaking, movements have not failed after achieving 3.5% of the population's participation.
It sounds very small, 3.5%.
3.5% is a very large absolute number of people. So in the US, for example, we'd be talking about 11.5 million people, which would be about 2.5 or 3 times the size of the Women's March of 2017, which was the largest single-day demonstration in US history. So even though it sounds proportionally small, it's really quite a large number of people.
The 3.5% is not an ironclad rule. Mass anti-government protests in Bahrain have failed to yield concessions. There's intriguing research, not Erica's, that in some parts of the world, protest against despotism has produced better results when it emerges in cities than from the countryside.
At least in African countries, urban protests were much more likely to lead to successful anti-colonial independence movements, but they were also much more likely to lead to democracy in the longer term. Whereas rural insurgencies were more likely to be brutally repressed, and if they led to independence, were more likely to bring to power despots.
Urban areas tend to be more middle class than rural areas. But the main reason why repressive governments should fear the city more than the country is that in the city it's simpler to mobilize large numbers.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it's much easier and more convenient to assemble mass in urban areas. Urban areas also often have universities, which are really important because it's often students and academics that start to organize these movements. And the more universities are in a location, the more likely you are to have the onset of a nonviolent uprising.
At the time of recording, the United States remains a democracy. Watch this space. But if that research is right, it suggests that one place any future US despot should be wary of is Erica's current home. The same city which back in the 18th century kicked off the US independence movement against the British.
Well, I think Boston, Massachusetts has something like 50 institutions of higher ed in a very small space, so...
The revolution always starts in Boston.
That's what Bostonians like to think.
Well, that's it for this edition of The Big Idea on the BBC World Service. I'm David Edmonds. The producer was Robbie Wojciechowski. Show your peaceful support for this series by listening to more Big Ideas at bbcworldservice.com.
This is the BBC World Service, where teenagers talk to technology's pioneers.
What do our most successful innovators think about the inventions they unleashed upon the world?
1,000 songs in your pocket. No one ever had that experience before.
Teenagers like me get to question the people who invented the tech we take for granted, finding out how they came up with their ideas and asking for advice.
World Wise Web at bbcworldservice.com. And in 30 minutes, Outlook Weekend.
If you're planning on going into outer space, you're going to need a place to live. A sealed structure with food, air, and water. Well, an experiment in the 90s created such a place. It was called Biosphere 2, and it was as revolutionary as it was controversial.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
BBC World Service, it's 22 hours GMT. This is Oliver Conway with the newsroom. Joe Biden calls on Republicans not to push through a new Supreme Court justice before the presidential election.
Speaking to those Republicans out there, Senate Republicans, who know deep down what is right for the country and consistent with the Constitution.
Leaked documents reveal how some banks allowed criminals to move dirty money around the world. A judge stops the Trump administration banning the Chinese app WeChat.
This is the only means of communication available to millions of people who are Chinese speakers primarily and not able to use other means of communication.
And
we all knew that he's really good. We know that he's really talented. But to actually do this, that's incredible, and nobody expected that.
Delight back home as a 21-year-old Slovenian wins the Tour de France. First, our top stories.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. A huge leak of documents has revealed how billions of dollars of illicit funds have been laundered through some of the world's biggest banks. The details were gathered largely through details submitted by the banks themselves to regulators in the United States. Andy Verity has more details.
HSBC was mixed up in a scam a number of years ago called World Capital Markets, where American investors lost tens of millions of pounds, and HSBC was handling the money for the people who later turned out to be fraudsters. And when the American authorities notified HSBC and asked them about the accounts linked to the fraudsters, they didn't tell them that actually some of those fraudsters had accounts with the bank in Hong Kong, and they even continued to move money after the US authorities had been in touch about the scam.
The Democratic Party's presidential candidate Joe Biden has said it would be an abuse of power if Republican senators confirmed any US Supreme Court nominee put forward by Donald Trump before November's election. Mr. Biden urged them to follow their conscience. From Washington, Nomia Iqbal reports.
Speaking at the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, Joe Biden said he wanted those Republicans with a conscience to do the right thing. The former vice president paid tribute to Justice Ginsburg and said her family had repeated her dying wish to him to not be replaced until a new president is installed. Mr. Biden said if he wins in November, he should get the pick, adding, unlike Mr. Trump, he would work with both parties on it. The two women being considered by President Trump are thought to be judges Amy Coney Barrett and Barbara Lagoa. If the Republicans are successful in getting a quick replacement, it would make the Supreme Court dramatically more conservative.
Sudan says a high-level delegation has travelled to the United Arab Emirates to negotiate with American officials as the country tries to get removed from the US list of countries that sponsor terrorism. Will Ross reports.
Since the overthrow of President Omar al-Bashir last year, America has shown signs that it is willing to strike Sudan from its terror list. For the Khartoum government, that's vital because Sudan is in a deep economic crisis and wants to access international finance institutions. But as part of the deal, the US has controversially proposed that Sudan pay $330 million in compensation to American victims of terror attacks. This is because of the support Mr. Bashir's government offered extremists. Also on the table is likely to be America's desire for Arab countries to normalize ties with Israel.
Bahrain says it has foiled an Iranian-backed plan to carry out terrorist attacks in the Gulf state. The Interior Ministry said an explosive device found in a street was placed to target a foreign delegation. Iran hasn't yet commented on the allegations. World News from the BBC. Ivory Coast's main presidential election challenger has called for a civil disobedience campaign to stop President Alassane Ouattara's bid for a third term in office in next month's elections. Henri Konan Bédié, a former president, declared that the opposition parties were united to protect the stability of the nation. Opposition campaigners in Belarus say more than 130 people have been arrested during the latest demonstrations against President Alexander Lukashenko. Most of the arrests were in the capital, Minsk. Coast Guards in Finland say they'll work through the night to stabilise a ferry that ran aground in the Åland Islands. More than 200 passengers have been evacuated from the vessel, and most of the crew have been taken safely to shore. The ship's operator said something had gone wrong with its steering before it became stranded. The 21-year-old Slovenian cyclist Tadej Pogačar has won a historic victory in the Tour de France, becoming the youngest champion for more than 100 years. He took the podium in Paris with 3 of the 4 coveted jerseys: yellow for overall winner, white for best young rider, and polka dot for the king of the mountains. Pogačar won in the final time trial on Saturday, overhauling his compatriot Primož Roglic, who had held first place for most of the 3-week race. Slovenia's president Borut Pahor, who watched the final stage, said both Pogačar and Roglic now had a special place in the hearts of Slovenians.
It's unbelievable. I've never thought that I would be in Paris celebrating the victory Tour de France of 2 of our guys. It's an unbelievable feeling. Being honest with you, I'm speechless. I'm so happy and so proud. Both are our kings. Slovenia now have 2 kings and 1 president. It's so simple as that.
That's the latest BBC News.
Thanks very much. You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with Oliver Conway. The death of the US Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg has injected new rancour into an already bitter election campaign. There are sharp disagreements over whether a new judge should be appointed immediately or after the presidential poll in November. The 9 justices serve for life and have a huge impact on American society, even helping determine the result of the presidential election in the year 2000. President Trump has said he will nominate a woman to replace the long-standing Liberal justice in the next week. Democrats fear that could lock in a conservative majority on the court. The Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden has called on Republican senators to vote against an immediate appointment.
Look, I'm not being naive. I'm not speaking to President Trump, who'll do whatever he wants. I'm not speaking to Mitch McConnell, who'll do what he wants, and he does. I'm speaking to those Republicans out there, Senate Republicans, who know deep down what is right for the country and consistent with the Constitution as I stand here in the Constitution Center, not just what's best for their party.
In a similar situation near the end of Barack Obama's presidency, Republican senators refused to confirm his nomination. So will any Republicans listen to Joe Biden's appeal? Nomi Iqbal is our correspondent in Washington.
The thing with Joe Biden is he knows the Republicans. You don't spend half a century on the political stage like he has and not make at least a few friends. He was actually on the Senate Judiciary Committee, which oversees Supreme Court justice appointments. That position is now occupied by Senator Lindsey Graham. But as we've heard, Joe Biden said he's trying to get those Republican senators on board who know that putting forward a nominee this close to the election is not the thing to do. Already, there are a couple of Republicans who agree with him. Susan Collins and Lisa Murkowski, they have said they won't be backing a nominee before the election. You know, potentially he could be appealing to Mitt Romney, the Utah senator who also ran to be president in 2012. And more famously, he was the only Republican to vote for Mr. Trump's impeachment. And to put it mildly, Mr. Romney and President Trump do not like each other. So I'm sure Mitt Romney's on Joe Biden's mind. But, you know, ultimately they have to have at least 4 Republican senators to join the Democrats in sinking a nomination.
Yeah, and if that doesn't happen, interesting that the Democrats are talking about taking the nuclear option should Joe Biden win and then expand the Supreme Court. Is that possible?
It could happen theoretically if the Democrats do win the presidency and the Senate. If the Republicans lose, however, they could still confirm President Trump's nominee after the election because, of course, the Senate remains the same. It is a Republican majority of 53. It will remain like that from November the 3rd to at least the first week of January, the so-called lame duck session. But the Democrats are saying if the Republicans try and push it through during that session, and they do go on and win, they are going to firmly be back in power. They will play dirty, and as you say they will expand the court to include more judges, more liberal judges, the ones that they would prefer to have on the bench. But the thing for Mr. Trump, this does put him back in the driver's seat because, of course, the coronavirus pandemic is still a big issue, and it's his weak spot. It's something he's not really managed to get a grip of. It seems like it's happening to him. Whereas with the Supreme Court justice drama, he is now playing the cards and everyone is waiting to see who he will pick. And he said he's going to make that announcement in about a week's time. So that will be before September the 29th, a key date, because that's when the first presidential debate will happen.
Nomi Iqbal in Washington. Leaked documents have revealed how British banks helped criminals, money launderers and Russians subject to international sanctions. The secret banking reports show how the banks failed to stop crime even when they suspected it. The documents, known as the FinCEN files, were leaked to BuzzFeed News and shared with the BBC's Panorama programme by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Richard Bilton reports.
This is the first time we've been able to see the secret files that show how banks deal with crime and suspect behaviour. The leak is of suspicious activity reports, what banks send to the authorities if they think clients may be up to no good. What's shocking is how often they then do nothing. Fergus Shiel is from the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists.
This is an unprecedented and remarkable leak that tells us, as never before, what the banks know about suspicious money movements. It connects with virtually every country on the planet, and it connects with some of the worst financial scandals ever in history, and some of the worst criminal and terrorist activity on the planet.
HSBC allowed fraudsters to move $30 million around the world after being told by US investigators it was a scam. And a close ally of President Putin, sanctioned by the US and EU, used Barclays in London to buy fine art. Neither bank would comment on these cases, but HSBC said it had overhauled its ability to combat financial crimes. Barclays said a US Senate report had highlighted their significant cooperation with relevant authorities. The leak is not just about individual banks. The documents show how the UK's financial system is failing to stop dirty money, and that has tarnished Britain's reputation. One leaked report shows how the US Treasury compares the UK to higher risk jurisdictions such as Cyprus.
Richard Bilton reporting. The world's most famous cycling race, the Tour de France, has crowned its youngest winner in more than a century. 21-year-old Tadej Pogacar is also the first Slovenian to win the contest. He took the leader's yellow jersey on Saturday in dramatic fashion from the favourite and fellow Slovenian Primož Roglic. Our correspondent Guy Delauny sent this report from the winner's hometown.
The village of Kamenda is celebrating their most famous son's victory in the world's greatest bike race in appropriate style. They've got the village band in the centre of the roundabout here, and they've painted the outside of it completely yellow, and cyclists from all over this area are riding round and round to mark the occasion of Slovenia's greatest ever sporting victory.
Everybody's very proud, of course, of what he does. We all knew that he's really good. We know that he's really talented. But to actually do this, that's incredible, and nobody expected that.
We are a nation who like to cycle to job, to work with friends and families.
How are you going to celebrate?
We already celebrate now with bicycle.
There are plenty of Pogacar fans in Paris as well. Charter planes took hundreds of Slovenians to the French capital this morning, and Slovenia's President Borut Pahor is among them. A few days ago, he told the BBC that he'd give Primož Roglic a big kiss if he won the race. It remains to be seen if the offer stands for Pogačar.
Guy Lawney reporting from Slovenia. You're listening to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. A reminder of our headlines from Debbie.
Joe Biden has urged US Senate Republicans to follow their conscience and not to push through a new Supreme Court judge before November's presidential poll. Leaked documents detailing millions of dollars worth of transactions have revealed how some of the world's biggest banks allowed criminals to move dirty money around the world. And an American judge has blocked plans to ban the Chinese app WeChat.
Yes, the US Department of Justice had tried to stop the messaging and payment service appearing in US app stores from today, saying it posed a threat to national security. But the Californian judge Laurel Wheeler said that move would damage free speech. Michael Bien is one of the lawyers representing the WeChat Users Alliance.
This is the only means of communication available, even in the United States, to millions of people who are Chinese speakers primarily and not able to use other means of communications in a daily way. And of course, it is the only way of communicating with their friends and family in China, because China blocks other apps from working within its borders.
President Trump has said both WeChat and TikTok pass user data onto the communist authorities in China, something they deny. A ban on TikTok is on hold after the president said he backed a partnership deal between TikTok's Chinese owner and two US firms. For more on the row over WeChat, I spoke to our technology correspondent James Clayton in San Francisco.
The way to think of WeChat is a little bit like an operating system rather than an app. So the way that a lot of people describe it is it's like Amazon because you can sell stuff on it. It's like Facebook because there are lots of social media elements to it. It's a bit like Tinder because you can literally shake your phone if you have WeChat and it will connect you with other people if you're interested in that. And loads more. You can run businesses on it. For many people in China, WeChat is almost like an extension of their phone, and they are really, really protective about it.
Of course, as he runs for re-election, President Trump has taken a hardline stance against China. But why specifically did his administration want to ban WeChat?
He's focused on two companies, right? TikTok, if you actually ask security experts, it's a much more grey area. So they say, look, in theory, they could pass on information to China, but all of the data is held outside of China, and they obviously deny it. WeChat is a slightly different story. There's actual tangible proof that, for example, WeChat has, for COVID-19, suppressed conversation about that in the January, February, in those early months when COVID-19 was just breaking. There are all sorts of other accusations against WeChat too. So they're very different beasts. I think in terms of a security threat, WeChat is certainly perceived as a greater risk than TikTok.
Nevertheless, the judge didn't buy that argument. I mean, what is the legal battle? Where does it go from here?
Yeah, so I think this is more of a stay of execution for now. There are going to be all sorts of legal toings and froings here. I suppose it's quite interesting, really, where Trump wants to go from here. It's interesting. I actually spoke to Tencent that owns WeChat the other day, and Tencent have an absolutely huge gaming industry in the US. WeChat isn't actually that important to them in the US. They have 80, 90 million users, but really the vast chunk of revenue that they get from the US is on gaming, and they're desperate to protect that. So you haven't actually heard Tencent really trying to push back against Trump in the same way that you've seen TikTok do.
Nevertheless, is this court ruling in California a victory for China, and how big a setback is it for the Trump administration?
I don't think it's a massive setback for the Trump administration. I don't think many people know what WeChat is outside the Chinese diaspora, and I think with the TikTok deal, he can say, look, what I did, I pushed back against China. TikTok is now headed up in the US. It's created 25,000 jobs in Texas. So look what I can do. You push back against China and look at the rewards you can get. So I think that he'll see that as a win. I don't think you'll see this judgment as a particular loss.
James Clayton in San Francisco. Meanwhile, the US government's attempt to reimpose US